Hey folks, welcome back. It's good to have you here. I am once again with Alexander Love for another round, another show, another episode. Welcome, Alexander. It's good to
Thank
have you.
you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. I've been hearing such amazing things about our podcast recording, the plural, our podcast recordings from our listeners. So thank you for the gift of your presence on this show and feel really grateful to have you here again today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Glad people are enjoying it.
So let's see where we go. Um, and the loose intention for today, or what we've sensed into as our line of exploration, is two things. Number one, protector parts, and number two, creating from soul. So, yeah, maybe maybe I can speak to a little bit about creating from soul after you speak to protector parts. Would you be open to
Yeah. Yeah.
sharing?
And then we can just see kind of where we head from
Yeah.
there. Well, I think that protector parts are a really important conversation because these sort of dimensions of our being that are um, guardians, their intentions are always good, and they're attempting to protect us from having really strong, overwhelming emotions. And yet they most often make these parts of us make choices around how to help us that tends to cause issues. And I've found that being able to differentiate between the protector parts and other parts of us can be absolutely vital because very often it's these protector parts that are um, engaging in a lot of our behaviors that we dislike, whether it's eating the whole bag of potato chips, whether it's being a control freak, these kinds of things that come up for all of us. Um, these are our protectors. And to be able to understand that and then to find ways to be with these parts so that these aspects of us can uncover their true intentions and then begin to help us through expressing those good intentions becomes a really powerful tool for how we can take the parts work world and make it practical on the ground and off the cushion, so to speak.
Yeah, beautiful. I noticed a strong impulse to zoom out and create a little bit of context. I imagine anybody listening to this recording is aware that as individuals, we are a collective, right? Forest is as an individual Forest, I've got a bunch of parts in here, and as an individual Alexander has a bunch of parts. And for any of you listening, you might notice uh, a happy one or a sad one, or Um, the language of protector parts comes from Richard Schwartz and internal family systems. Is that true that that comes from IFS?
Certainly, he makes those distinctions and talks about them specifically using the language protector parts. But um, I think it's a very Western, modern Western sort of notion of thinking of us as individuals. If you look at the Chinese character that means to awaken, what it shows is it shows the character for the heart, and then next to that it shows a mouth, and above it there's the number five. And mouth is like a portal. It's a passageway. It doesn't just mean your concrete mouth. It means something like a mouth. So it's a passageway. And then the number five, in the old days, Chinese characters have an evolution to them. The earlier characters, it looks like Roman numeral 10. It looks like an X with a bottom line and a top line. And what that means is is the number 5 is talking about everything between heaven and earth with a middle. And so then if you take that all together, awakening is basically the 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 act of your heart awakening to, or sort of, it's the aperture of your heart opens
Mm.
to the self as everything between heaven and earth. And so from an Eastern perspective, we are very much a multiplicity. They wouldn't say you have this part and that part and this part. That's a more Western psychological term. But they would say you have a heart official and a lung official and a liver official and this spirit and that spirit. And they think of us as an interdependency, not as a single entity. So I just wanted to kind of say that, yes, protector parts are popularized by IFS, and certainly some of the things I'll be talking about are inspired by that. But there's a bigger, broader tradition of looking at us as a multiplicity that I wanted to just kind of drop into the well.
Yeah, beautiful. I just appreciate using the word multiplicity, and it I oftentimes say the Western culture hasn't caught up to multiplicity yet. We haven't quite collectively gotten to multiplicity. And I notice my hands actually go to my heart in this, because in my personal history, when I first became aware of being a multiple, I thought I was schizophrenic, or um, had multiple personalities, right? It was like a really horrifying experience. So I also just feel care for anybody listening who might be learning for the first time that this is actually a totally normal part of development and a normal part of the human experience, to have more than one voice in our head, more than one part of our psyche and being.
Absolutely. Absolutely natural.
And so some of these parts are given the label of protector parts, as
Mhm.
distinction compared to some other labels that aspects of us could get, which maybe you could speak to.
Yeah, so one way to think about it is that we're going along in our life, and some event happens where, for whatever reason, the intensity of that experience doesn't have to be negative, but the intensity of that experience is too much for us to bear. We're not able to remain present. Um, and what can happen in those moments is there can be an act by our psyche to try to save us from too strong of a feeling. And so the body will, the psyche, the soma psyche will put something into, you could say, latency. It puts something into hiding. And one of the things that will do that are our protector parts. They're the ones that are not typically the shadow. You can have protectors that are shadow. Um, that's definitely happens. And we can talk more about that later. It definitely even happens a lot. But at the same time, most of the parts that are kind of around on a daily basis, unless you're in a very safe environment with people that are, you feel really, really safe with, most of the time you're going to protect your parts. They're not shadow. They're there. You can see, oh, the part of me that, wants to, give that person the finger, flip someone the bird. And, oh, that part of me that thinks that you're an idiot. And the part of me that's telling me that I'm an idiot. Um, those are often the protectors. And so you have these protectors that are visible often, not always, and they're attempting to keep the vulnerable parts hidden unless we feel safe. Unless we, someone embraces us and says, "Hey, I really want to know how you're doing." Those protectors may soften, and then the vulnerable dimensions of being will come forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and one specific nuance in this line of exploration that I feel like I've really connected with you around is that a lot of parts work and internal family systems work and inner world work, in my experience, tends to be very focused on getting to those more vulnerable parts of ourselves and working through the core wound or the deep trauma or the inner child or that aspect of us. And
Mhm.
one of the things that I was starting to see in my coaching world and had never really had anyone to have this experience with. I remember when we were in Boulder a couple of years ago, and I said something like, it's like you work through the deeper stuff with a client, and then you come back and they're still having this issue, and it's like
Right.
the other part, the protector part, is still in a pattern of protecting a wound that isn't even there anymore.
That's right.
And I feel like we had a lot of connection on that. So I wanted to name
Yeah.
that as a distinction of we can go in and heal the deep core wound and then still be having a really hard time in our life because of a protector part who's playing a role that is arguably not even needed anymore.
Yeah. So two things come up for me there. One, just along the lines of what you're saying, is that yes, we can certainly heal a bunch of things, some of these deeper wounds that we have. Um, but usually those wounds, they're informing how we're arguing with our neighbor, but it's not always that those core wounds are going to be all the way out on the surface arguing with our neighbor. There's going to be protector parts that are having that argument, even as if that core wound may be hiding in there and saying, nobody loves me and I'm a terrible person and I'm not worth it. That's there too, but they may not be the one. Not always. We don't want to say 100% anything because all sorts of weird stuff happen. But it's often the protectors that are helping you interface with the world. And so it's absolutely true that if we don't take care of these protectors, and some of these protectors are very sophisticated in their language. And this gets to the second thing I wanted to mention is that part of what can happen is if we're only in the process of working with parts inside of a session, but we're not in the practice of differentiating between parts and the unbroken soul. And if some of our protectors are very sophisticated, we might just think that that's just how I am. That's what I believe. That's just the thing that's going on right now. And when we do that, it means that we're living in the world from a fragmented place, thinking that we're just coming from who I am or who we are. And I see this happen all the time in very advanced circles where people do a lot of parts work and they do a lot of shadow work and they do a lot of coaching and all kinds of personal development stuff. And yet parts are taking them over all of the time. And in many cases, 3 parts or 4 parts are taking them over within the span of 2 or 3 sentences. And there's no differentiation between what is happening and those deeper forces that is always automatically compassionate, whole, interested, and curious. And so if we have parts that are taking over that luminosity, um, now we have, issues. We have some sort of difficulty in the relational domain.
Yeah, the snickering trickster in me is like, if you're saying it's just the way I am, it's almost a guarantee that you're not coming from who you really are.
That's right. That's right. Because when we look at, when we look at the luminosity of the soul, the soul has a capacity for an all sides sort of orientation. It doesn't mean we can't set boundaries. It doesn't mean we're okay with anything or now we have no ethics or anything like that. But if you look at Gebser's use of the word a as a prefix, a perspectival, it doesn't mean like no perspective. He uses the word a in the positive sense. Um, a perspectival means free from a particular perspective, which means we're getting into that capacity for integrality of sort of considering all sides, and the soul has a natural disposition to do that. Whereas parts, they tend to have an agenda. Their agenda is to protect us, and they have good intentions, but often with sort of warped outcomes. And so they're typically not looking from an all-sided view until they transform and realize that they were never apart, that was just the myth of separation.
Hearing the words, the myth of separation, I just noticed a nice relaxing breath happening over here. Something that I have in the last few weeks had the privilege of doing a few sessions with you as a practitioner, you being a practitioner for me as a client. Uh, and something that I am just in love with about your work and really appreciating learning from you. I mean, there's many things I could speak to, but in this moment, what I feel most called to speak to is this metaphor you use of parts being an avocado and helping parts get to core the core of the avocado, the core seed, the core essence of what the part is and what kind of experience the part is trying to create for soul is how I experience it. And it's different to me than asking that part, what's your positive intent? It's more like going all the way in and supporting a part to see its own luminosity beyond even symbolic language.
Yeah, so yeah, beautiful. There's a couple things here. You'll hear both in IFS and also Kim Barta's work. There's the recognition of positive intent. And so there's a recognition, underneath that or inside of that concept is the recognition that we're fundamentally good and that this is true for parts as well. That even if they speak very cruelly to another person or to our own self, um, if we know how to ask the right questions from the right place, um, the cruelest parts will eventually reveal their goodness. Now, so I've been deeply influenced by Kim Barta and that notion of that goodness and that positive intent. I also was happy to discover that IFS also talks about that. But there's also something that Chinese medicine offers, which is where the avocado model sort of arises. And they have this recognition that there are layers of being, four layers, although three of them are most visible in the avocado. And for many people, three is all you really need. Um, and in a general way, you could say the surface of the avocado is sort of our conditioned autonomic, which means automatic responses. So somebody cuts you off and you yell at them without thinking about it ahead of time. It's sort of someone throws a ball at you and you just kind of do that, or some big scary man walks into the room and you respond just because anytime someone is a big scary and man and coming into your space, there's kind of an automatic sort of body animal response. The mushy part of the avocado is where there's a little more consciousness. This is like skin, blood, bones. So the mushy part of the avocado is like this, the blood aspect. This is often where our conscious emotions are, as opposed to like a mood, which is like, I don't know, I feel kind of meh, and I don't really know why. Like a mood would be more surface because it doesn't have specific targets. It's just kind of like an atmosphere. Whereas in Chinese medicine, an emotion has consciousness in it. It's in the blood, and there's an animating spirit in the blood, and there's a kind of an awareness that, oh, I'm sad because you told me that you changed your mind, or I'm sad because you told me that you don't love me anymore, or something like that. And so this mushy part of the avocado or our blood layer is related more to conscious emotion and cognition, which includes our stories, the narratives that we have, such as I'm protecting you because we're no good, or I'm going to have you eat the bag of chips because then you won't feel too much. Like that kind of conscious narration and the story is embedded from a Chinese perspective, Chinese medicine perspective, in that blood layer. Then we go into the seed layer and we get to the seed layer is the essential layer. One character for essential shows um, like this pure water that's like that's bubbling out of a mountainside. and it can be translated as essence. And so this place is an unbroken dimension of being. In the way that I'm looking at it here, we're looking at the layers of the avocado layers of a part, or the avocado layers of the heart. There's other ways to look at the avocado model, but in our context, we're looking at a part of the self, or that um, sort of the layers of the heart, you could say. And so in this third layer, what we're connecting to is it's pluripotent. It's a word I learned from Kevin McKee. Uh, he's like, you have to know this word. Pluripotent, it's like stem cellularity. It's like an ocean that can become anything in any context. So it can become love, it can become stillness, it can become passion, it can become ease. Any of the virtues that any tradition that you've encountered talks about is born from this third layer of the heart. And this is really that soul depth. When we're here, we don't have any problems. It's not that we don't have things, I don't mean that we don't have challenges and that there aren't things that, I mean, as human beings, like it seems to be our charge is to interact with challenges. So when I say we don't have problems, I don't mean we're just like this pristine person with no issues and nothing ever comes up. It's quite the contrary. What I mean is the soul has no problem with any problem that we might have to face. It doesn't perceive it as a problem. It perceives it as a place to lean in and to learn and to grow, no matter how catastrophic.
Mhm.
It's the protector parts and also the other parts of us that are uncomfortable with the things that arise in our lives, but not this third layer, nor the fourth layer. And so we can look at this in the context of parts as well, that all parts have conditioned responses, the outer layer. All parts have narratives. They have certain emotional content that they're producing, that they're holding, they're absorbing. So usually they produce an emotion and then they just like, it kind of gets stuck there and it just kind of sits there, as well as narratives about what is true and about the self, about the world. And then all parts, as well as all who we are, we have this deep essential luminosity. And so the idea is that if we can begin to learn how to navigate through these layers, then we have an incredible possibility to train our nervous system to lead from and make choices from this place of wholeness. And that when parts arise, we train them to not take over, or if they do, it's not for very long. It's like for 4 or 5 seconds. We're like, oh, you took over again. And then they're like, oops, sorry, I just got nervous. And then we invite them to unblend, build back the bond with them. And then we go about driving down the street from wholeness. So it becomes a important in session dynamics, but it also becomes important out in the world as a very practical way of sorting out where we want to make choices from.
I want to speak about the practical ways of where we make choices from and the nervous system bit. I also want to, it sounded, you mentioned the word luminosity, and I'm imagining that's the fourth layer. Is that true?
So the reason why I used the character for essential chi, referring to the pure waters, the character for pure, it's like the sun rising at the dawn. So sometimes the word pure gives people like people have different relationship to that word, but the actual image is a sun rising. Now, I used that character because there's water bubbling out of a mountain, but to me, metaphorically, it implies that it's still coming from somewhere. The fourth layer is the somewhere. It's so no, it's not any different than the luminosity. It's just a little bit more essential. It's like, I don't know, the liquid bones of existence, the liquid animating bones of existence that then give birth to this pluripotent sea of humanity that then has access to things like compassion and courage and um, whereas whereas that fourth layer, um, well, yeah, I'll just leave it. I'll just leave it at that and see where.
It sounds like the distinction is that the third layer has a human realm component to it, and the fourth feels a little bit more primordial, timeless.
Yeah, you could say that the fourth layer is more transpersonal. With that said, the depth of the soul has many of those qualities as well. It's just it's like light shining through a like stained glass. It's still light, whether you're looking at the source of the light or whether you're looking at the refracted colors of the light. But one is just the light, and the other is also just the light, but now it's green and yellow and um, red and feels like satisfaction or feels like warm love or feels like a deep ocean, whereas the light is just the light. There's less differentiation. And yet it's all light and unbroken. For the purposes of our discussion with parts, though, really the three, like practically speaking on the ground, the three layers is all we need. Because like I want to be clear also for the listeners that like we're talking about things like luminosity, but sometimes it's not like that.
Mm.
Sometimes it's like, oh, I can just feel that I'm curious. It's not like there's like blinding luminous soul forces that are like permeating all of my being, like it can be like that, but it can also just be like, oh, I'm curious and I want to be here. And like that's the beginning and end of it. And that's enough from a practical perspective when you're driving down the street and you're trying to check into, or you're in a conversation and I'll use that example, you're in a conversation and you're wanting to check in. Am I coming from parts or am I coming from wholeness? It might be as simple as, and here's the practical tool that I borrowed from IFS. You can ask, how do I feel towards? So let's say you're in a conversation with your friend and you're wanting to check in about whether you're coming from parts or wholeness. And they go, well, how do I feel towards my friend? Well, if it's something like, oh, I'm curious, I feel loving, I feel interested, that's probably some degree of that third layer. If instead you're like, oh, I'm scared, oh, I'm a little nervous, oh, I don't like them right now, oh, I'm annoyed, I'm trepidatious, that lets you know that a part has stepped in front of that light bulb. So I just want to make sure it doesn't sound like someone needs to like reach enlightenment to like do this kind of protector parts work that I'm suggesting. It can be as simple as, oh no, I just feel a little curious and I'm happy to be here.
Mhm.
That's also how that may feel.
Yeah, and there's also a for anyone listening to this, you just if you're anything like me or if your parts are anything like mine, you might also keep like I want to speak to a distinction here in the nervous system. You spoke about the nervous system, and for me, the nervous system is actually where I find the deepest connection to whether or not I'm coming from wholeness and coming from soul, or if I'm coming from a part. And what I wanted to say, just what I was going to say is we can have parts hijack this language, and we can be coming from a protector part and be in a kind of triggered state and go, yeah, I feel curious. I want to know more. And it's like, actually,
Yeah, that's
um,
right.
and
That's
so,
right.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that's true, and it's common with people that are coaches or some sort of a practitioner or have done some sort of facilitation, they have facilitator parts. It reminds me once I was in a class. I had this herb teacher. She opened the whole world of Chinese medicine to me. Her name is Thea Elijah, and she's very, very tuned in, and she just knows things. And I remember one time I was taking a class with her, and we were doing some sort of a thing where I was being the practitioner, and somebody was laying on a table, and I was holding their ankles. And she looks over and she's like, "Why don't you explore not being such a practitioner in your focus?" And I was like, what? And then I realized, oh, I was like being very focused and I was being a diligent practitioner. And I was like doing this thing where healing was happening. And she used different words than what we're using now, but she was basically pointing out just that thing that we may have very stable looking protector parts. And they sometimes sound just like these words. And I don't know, maybe you're getting to this, Forrest, you can tell me, but for me, it's also quite a somatic experience where I'm like, if I'm doing it now, I'm in touch with my heart and I'm feeling for a quality of being, not just words. And right now, if I were to describe the quality of being, it's like there's a lightness and a playfulness and just a gladness. There's no ambivalence. I'm not like, do I want to be here on this planet? There's like, it's just like a flowing thing. And when parts take over, the first thing that I notice two things. One is this will feel hardened, like a little dampened, or I'll hear my own voice or feel my own sort of voice thoughts in my head, and it feels like it gets more angular. So for me, there's a somatic element to it because I'm a very sensory creative critter.
Mhm.
For others, it may be visual, or there may be some other way in which you come to know it most quickly. Most quickly, by that, why I'm saying that is usually if parts are taking over, don't, we need to be able to tell without being as sophisticated as we're capable of. So, like, what's the easiest sense
Yeah.
that you have? And that'll be different for everyone. For me, it's more sensory. Um, but you'll all find your own way to what it sounds and feels like and looks like, and when you're in wholeness or when you're beginning to verge out of it.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that you use the word dampen because for me it's like the light is not as bright. Like
The
that,
light is not as bright.
yeah.
I also want to just make a distinction that you can be, I like to call these shadow blooms, is usually what I call them, where you're still in wholeness, the brightness is still present, and there can still be parts that are talking to you that are annoyed and pissed off and freaked out and all this kind of stuff. The key here is it taking over the light, or am I the light or the lightness or the curiosityness in relationship to the part that's having a hard time? So there's plenty of examples where you can have all kinds of stuff going on with protector parts or exiled parts or the core wounds or any of those things and still be rooted in this place where you're just simply, at a basic level, you're trying to build relationship from that deeper place to the part.
Mhm, mhm.
And that is where the healing happens. That the healer is not coming from the practitioner per se, the coach or the therapist or whatever. Um, for me, the ideal, of course, the practitioner is presencing this place of wholeness, so it makes it easier. But to me, the most ideal scenario is that I'm in I'm in wholeness. I invite my client into wholeness, and then I support them to have a conversation between their place of wholeness and their parts, rather than I'm coming from wholeness as the practitioner and I'm talking directly to the parts. Now, sometimes you do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I usually only do that if it's the only option or if I have a specific question. But then as soon as I can, I want to go back to wholeness in client wholeness and practitioner, wholeness and client, and then helping them talk from their wholeness to their parts, because that's the relationship of intimacy that helps the parts really open. And if someone is feeling like they're trying to work with their parts and something feels stuck, like they're like they're trying to work on this thing and something just feels stuck and like it's not moving, it's probably because they're not actually rooted in wholeness. Because once they root in wholeness, they'll know what to do. They won't be confused, because that's usually a confused part that comes in. It's like, I don't know what to do and I'm confused and it's stuck, and it kind of gets in the way of what actually needs to happen.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm getting in touch with this awareness, this texture and quality of experience too, which is the difference that it makes to work with a practitioner, even if the practitioner is not coming from a practitioner part, but to work with a practitioner who, number one, is aware that healing is happening all the time, and it's more a metaphors that we're liberating than it is, oh, I'm this amazing healer who's healing you. There's like a
Right. That's definitely a part.
right. So that's yeah, right. That's definitely a part. So there's this like awareness of healings beyond the people who are healed, and we get to receive it. And then two, this awareness of power dynamics. I mean, there's a big piece of empowerment in what you're speaking to, of supporting people to connect to their own wholeness, and also um I don't know, like I want to say a loss of interest of like I don't actually like as a person, as a practitioner or anything, a loss of interest of having someone else's power and going like we want to see everybody empowered. What we're interested in is seeing everybody embodied in our own power
Yeah,
and emanating and radiating into the universe.
that's right. Because as soon as the session's over, the practitioner isn't there. So who's going with them to the dinner table
mhm.
when they're going to, have this great healing session and then go to the dinner table and scream at their kid? And it's like, well, they're going to the dinner table. And so that's why for me, learning, doing parts work in a session is only the beginning. Because one of the things that happens as a feature of being in at least the kind of parts work that I do with people, one of the things that we do, if necessary, is the person starts to build trust with their protectors. Yes, we want to get to those underlying things, but in some people, not everybody, but in some people, their protectors are very distrustful. They don't know that wholeness exists. When they look at the person, this is a cool question that I learned from IFS. You ask a part, how old do you think I am? And the part will be like, oh, you're 5. The reason why the reason why that protector is telling you they think you're 5 is that when they look at you, they don't see you as unbroken wholeness. They see you as the part they're protecting. So they think that there's a 5-year-old that they need to protect. So of course they're getting in the way all the time. What 5-year-old can run an adult life and be in like a marriage or be in a complex relationship where there's things to work out and all that? And so there's an invitation here to first, before before getting into the question of how do we help deep wounds heal, do we have a trusting relationship between wholeness and all of our protectors? So that when the going gets rough, those protectors begin to find a trusting place to let you stay in wholeness when you have the hard conversation. And that's a game changer. Doesn't mean it's going to happen all the time. It doesn't happen for me all the time. Happens more and more, but not all the time. But it becomes a game changer because it's less about healing the wound, which I also believe is important, and more about how do I go to the dinner table and be able to multitask
Mhm,
with parts that I'm building a loving relationship with
mhm.
so that they're not taking over and screeching.
Yeah, and hearing you, I want to speak to a different angle of this, which is
Mhm.
culture. both
Yeah.
in our inner world and in the outer world. But there's a couple things I could illuminate, at least one in the inner world and one in the outer world. So one is, um, and I share this with everyone because of the impact it's had. It's like there's a culture now in my inner world, in the human being called Forrest and with all of his parts. Everyone has agreed, hey, this is a warm, welcoming, loving, inviting place. And
Mhm.
we have explicitly all agreed and raised our hands and voted that we want to create a culture where all of us is welcome and we can see each other in our essence and look for the luminosity in each of us. We know every part has a positive intent. And it's like the experience is like all the parts that were hiding in the back bedrooms and all the defensive protectors have been like, okay, we've seen enough reps of how this goes now that we
That's right.
get it. And if we come out here in the light with everybody else, the track record is pretty consistent. We're loved, we're welcomed, we're invited in, we're seen, we're celebrated, we're cared for, we're asked about our experience and what matters most to us. We have a chance to express our needs and get support and how to get those met. And that's like it's not just an interpersonal dynamic thing, it's a whole culture component internally.
That's right. And you know what, just to speak to what you said and sort of give some voice for the listeners, it's like when what you're hearing in what Forrest is saying, one of the things that you're hearing in what Forrest is saying is an example of a trusting collective, a trusting inner collective. And many of us, you might find something different where parts are sort of fighting with each other. And there's a lot of infighting. Everybody's trying to take over. And um, I see that a lot too, more often than not. And um, what I would love to just point to is that in what you're sharing, Forrest, you're showing that there's a possibility for training the system as well as the nervous system to have that be a more normalized experience, which really helps a lot when the shit hits the fan. Because when something difficult happens, then maybe one or two parts kind of get rustled. In contrast with something difficult happens and the whole culture just goes nuts. That can feel very overwhelming. And many times, what we will do in those cases is we just shut down or we just act from impulses. And um, what you're describing, I've found is possible for everyone. And sometimes, if we've had a history of really intense trauma, um, it takes some uh, conscious working with until the system sees. It's like every time you do a parts work session and you show you mirror you show inside yourself that you are that loving person. It's like you were saying, all the other parts, even the ones that are not really part of the session, it's as if they're watching. They start to get the picture like, oh. And what I would hope for all of our listeners is that at some point you can say that for your from your part's perspective, you, meaning the place in you that is luminous and unbroken, that place in you is the most loving and the most loving place that this part knows. So that when you're sitting on the Zoom screen, I was smiling before because uh, I usually hear when people talk about seeing their image reflected back to them on the Zoom screen, people are like, "Oh, I hate seeing myself," and like, "Oh, I don't like it. I don't like it," and like it makes me blah blah blah. And I was laughing because whenever I see my self looking back at me, it always makes me really happy because like I've been the kindest to myself, and I've been around kind people, but it's just like you were saying, your system starts to be like, wow, like this guy is great.
Right.
Like he keeps showing up for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one last thing I'll say before I pause here is that what can happen is if we don't learn how to differentiate parts from wholeness, what can happen is we can live months with one part taking over. And then it dictates its perspective to all the other parts. And so that can create an incredible amount of distrust in the system because parts aren't necessarily nice to each other. And if they are, they're still one-sided and they still usually have agendas. And so if we are taken over by a part or two for months at a time, it can kind of create a distrust in the whole collective. When we start showing who that deeper luminosity is, that's when parts start to relax. And they start to be like, oh, this is a safe place to be, where we like everything you just said. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean I feel so privileged, quite frankly, and lucky and appreciative that I get to speak from where I'm speaking from right now, because in my history there's quite a bit of trauma, and also in my history there's quite a bit of shadow work and parts work with people like you and people like Kim Barta and the most amazing parts work practitioners in the world. So I'm speaking from a place of possibility, of some sense of like
That's right.
what's on the other side of this work. And when I say that, I mean I'm still doing parts work all the time. I mean, like I just did one session a week with you for 6 weeks in a row. Like I'm I'm still very much in this game and still very much working with parts all the time. And at the same time, there is a sense of being on the other side because there's a momentum, or there's a updraft, there's a um I experience as this ground, like even when the whole ground falls out, like you were talking about, it's like when everything goes wrong, there's this all pervasive, never not here experience of fundamental okayness and love and
Yeah.
connection and beauty. And this has got to be what's best because it's happening.
Yeah. And what you're describing is to me, it's one of the most important messages that I want to bring to the world as long as I'm breathing, is that place that you're pointing to is available to everyone. It doesn't matter developmental level. It doesn't matter. Um, doesn't matter nothing. Everyone has it, and it can be really covered up, but it's never gone. And one of the things that's most important to me is to help share with people that this is something that it's in Chinese medicine, or sort of those Eastern traditions, they might call it the true nature. Nature, the it shows the character for heart again, and then it shows this character for basically like a plant growing out of the ground with a bud, and it means to engender. So your nature is basically that which has been born in one's heart. In this case, the seed of one's heart, the essence of one's heart. And then true, basically it shows a tree with a little extra emphasis on the root. And so it means like your root nature, or your original nature, or your so there's sort of it's like those are the kinds of symbols that are often around this notion of your true nature. And but the basic idea is that no matter who you are, no matter how much trauma you've had, no matter how much painful experiences you've had, there's a place in you that is already okay, deeply okay. And we're talking about it in the parts work context. We could talk about it in the like the meditative context, or some other context. But the bottom line is it's there, already there right now in this moment, without any need to do something to be okay. There's something that's already intrinsically okay. Even as there's places in us that feel radically not okay, and they can occur simultaneously.
Yeah, that the bit about mm, it being able to occur simultaneously, parts that are radically not okay while the while our true nature is fundamentally okay, brings up podcasts of discussions that we could have, because in my history it's been so easy to create some kind of thing that suppresses what isn't okay in the name of
Yeah,
okayness. And recently I've been playing with this other orientation of the parts that don't feel okay. How do I language it? I never attempted to language this before, so bear with me here. It's like coming coming from wholeness and what's most essential, coming from the fundamental okayness, knowing that in each of the parts and allowing any parts that don't feel okay to speak with this. It's almost like an in the moment transmutation or refinement that's happening, because it's like there's a process of allowing essence itself to speak through the part. And so there's like, you don't miss anything in the part, but you also don't act out the jankiness or the distortion. It's like what's most pure and what's most essential permeates through the part and clears what needs to be cleared. Maybe that, yeah. How's that to hear?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, it speaks to the self-liberating nature of awareness, that it's already self-liberating and it's not somewhere else. And so there can be times when, we'll have an inner spatial sort of experience where like I'm in wholeness and the part's over here and I'm loving the part and the part is self-liberating and it feels like there's a I over here and a part over there and we're sort of speaking in spatial and temporal terms because we're sort of very oriented to fullness, which has space and time in it. But from another perspective, and this is also that fourth layer, from another perspective, um, everything that's ever happening at all times is only ever one thing happening. And it has a self-liberating nature to it. And so this gets us into this is something that comes up in Eastern traditions as well as like doing nothing, um, which it doesn't mean you're not there's sort of you use the word allowing. There's like a way in which um, something is already occurring. And if we just become the only thing that's occurring without a doer, then things occur. And that includes the self-liberating nature of the only thing that's occurring. And so I'll find in me sometimes, and we can talk more about sort of the two different ways that sort of protectors can show up if you want to later, but I'll have a controlling aspect of me, a controlling protector part that's like, well, let's differentiate and let's wrap this up and like let's transform this part. And it's another part that sort of has a very controlly sort of oriented thing. And I'll find that in those moments, well, one, that nothing is all the things that part of me is trying to do is not working because it's a part trying to do a healing process without wholeness as the facilitator. And what I'll have to do often is, and it may be what you're describing or some version of that, where instead of trying to separate, I just go fully in to the experience of what's happening and discover that deeper nature on the inside
Mhm,
rather than trying to hug it from true nature on the outside.
mhm,
And both of these are effective. I'm not suggesting that one is like the thing to do and the other isn't, but I found sometimes, especially when things feel stuck and I feel like I'm really uh, tortured. And so there's like a way in which I'm like trying to get this process to like heal because I'm tortured. It's irritating to my nervous system that I just have to fully let go into and find the self-liberating nature of the thing that I was pushing away from,
mhm,
which is another way of saying like embracing those very subtle allergies
mhm.
until we realize that the allergies are a part of the one, as well as is the thing that I was allergic to is part of the one. And then the thing is just self-liberating.
on a practical experiential component of this, I recently have been, again, somatically, it seems like you and I really have this somatic bit and sensorial bit as a common passion or way through, really. It's beyond a passion. It's actually like a way
A
through
way
life,
to not die.
way to not die. Yeah. Yeah, and also quite frankly, and at least in my experience, I mean, I know everyone is, oh, let me just speak for myself. In my experience, also quite a bit more precise, uh,
Mhm.
refining the nervous system, refining the sensorial experience of the one and being able to feel distortions versus the purity. And yeah, what I wanted to speak to is playing with like squeezing everything in the physical concrete body and squeezing the mind and squeezing the subtle energetic body. Like I'll do this with a big inhale, squeeze everything as tight as possible into a dense concentration, and then exhale and release everything. And it's like this, it's like a myofascial release process for the larger being and being able to become aware of, and really without even having to consciously do it, rinse out and release places that are holding.
Yeah, since you mentioned that, I'd love to just add a little tool for folks. The name of this practice is, I learned it from Anna Chitty, and it's called Body Low Slow Loop. So we can just do it all together. We'll just do a couple rounds. It's very simple and it's a very powerful nervous system regulation practice. So the first part is body, and we can just all go into our bodies and just find the loudest sensation. It doesn't have to be negative, just finding the loudest sensation. The next part is the low part. Find the lower border of the sensation. So if the sensation was in your belly, just move down until you don't feel it anymore, and then turn around and go back up until you bump into it. That's the low part. Just notice the sensation, the bottom, the lower border of it. And then now we'll do the version that Forrest was describing. Um, Now squeeze all your muscles and then release. And then go ahead and loop back to the sensation. Notice how the sensation has changed. Now you're back at the beginning. This is the song that never ends. Now that you're back at the beginning. And so then you're at the body part again. We'll do it one more time. Find the lower border of the sensation. Now, this time, instead of squeezing your muscles, I'll give you an alternative because it's called body, low, and then the third part is slow. Go ahead and wiggle your toes really slowly and put all of your attention in your toes. Try to put 100% of your attention in your toes. The slowness just helps you stay focused. And then go ahead and loop back to the sensation. Noticing how it's changed. And now you're back at the beginning again. So it's called body, low, slow, loop. The slow part, you can either wiggle your toes or you can squeeze all your muscles. This is a really powerful tool to regulate a nervous system. It's more of a nervous system approach. Another approach is to talk to the part that's cranking up the nervous system and just asking them directly from wholeness if they'd be willing to turn the volume down. And they often will. Um, and so, depending on the situation, either one can be faster. It just depends on the person's relationship with their parts. Someone who has parts that are trusting, like yours, if I just said, "Hey, Forrest, what happens when you ask such and such a part that's cranking your nervous system up into fight or flight? What happens when you ask them to just turn it down?" You may find in like 2 seconds, they'll just go whoop. Um, Whereas other times, the body low slow loop works more quickly. I've seen body low slow loop bring people out of full blown panic attacks in like under 30 seconds.
Hmm. And is there a reason it's the low side of the sensation instead of the top, for example?
No, it's good for people that low. Another option would be feel the entire, the point is the most important thing is the edges of the sensation rather than going into the sensation. When you go into the sensation, you're going to turn the volume up on the intensity. So the implication here is that someone is doing this practice, unless they're doing it regularly just to train their nervous system, which I would highly recommend. You could just do it in the morning when you wake up for 3 minutes, and then in the night before you go to bed, and anytime during the day when you start feeling dysregulated. Um, you can do it that way, but you can also do it if there's an emergency. And so when there's an emergency, um, you want to touch the edges rather than dig in, because that can just make it more overwhelming. And then the protectors get very uncomfortable. And then you start getting all kinds of cuckoo stuff happening in there. The lower border is just to make it easy. Not everybody is familiar with embodiment. Some people they only will tell you that the sensations are in their head, which is maybe fine the first time, but after like 7 times later, over a course of many months, they only ever find sensations in their head. It probably means that they're disconnected from their body. And so just having them do a body scan and then having them find the lower border of a sensation, it's just a simpler approach. But if you have, and you meaning any one of our listeners, if you're accustomed to being in your body, then you could just feel the entire edges, the top, bottom, sides of the sensation. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I live in Colorado where it's really dry here. So sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I'm just wide awake. Just doing it that way, I mean, I can feel all the sensations, like all the sides, no problem, but the lower border works. So I'll just do it a couple times and then I'll just, I'll fall back asleep.
Mm. I'm taking a moment to take a breath because I know we can move through these things with pace, and I also know we're covering a lot of ground. So I'm just,
Yeah, we're going through a lot.
I'm ready to jump right back into creating from soul and how protector parts get involved in that. And I'm having a moment of maybe we'll just take a breath and give our
Yeah.
listeners a chance to take a breath.
Yeah. Yeah. And there might be, before we go into the soul thing, there might be one more distinction that would be helpful that we haven't touched on. Whenever you feel like it's a good time for that.
Yeah, I already noticed the shit like the downshift in pace. So
Yeah,
I'm just feeling care for listeners and knowing we're moving with speed as we well what you know.
that's right. You guys can always put it on like a 0.75 speed if you want to slow it down.
Yeah.
But I think also it's not so much the speed of the words, it's um we can both get kind of passionate and fast, which is fine, but if this is new information, then it can move by pretty quickly. Um, I wanted to just offer one more distinction, which is that protector parts can come in sort of two categories. Of course, there's a million kind of protectors, but they typically fall into two categories, a yin category and a yang category. Yin protectors, they tend to fall apart. Yang protectors tend to hold everything together. If people are familiar with IFS, the yin protectors are what IFS would call the firefighters. The yang protectors are what IFS would call the managers. I just prefer using a word that is less archetype-like and more category-like, just because it's just how my system orients to things. And so yin protectors are going to tend to fall apart and have us do the binging on Netflix, the eating too much stuff, the drinking the beer, the having the too much sex, all those kinds of things where basically what those parts are saying is, I don't want to feel, so I'm going to dissociate and numb out in some way so they don't have to feel. Now, the yang protectors, so if the yin protectors have like a gesture like this, where your things are falling apart, I'm floating away, I'm dissociating, I'm like, forget it, I'm just going to eat the whole pizza, that kind of vibe. Whereas the yang protectors are much more gripping, much more control oriented. They're the ones that are going to be like, I don't eat the whole pizza. I'm only going to eat half the pizza. I'm only going to eat three-quarters of the pizza and I'm going to measure it. I'm only going to watch one Netflix episode. And so you'll have the yang protectors. They're the ones that'll kind of stand behind you, be like, don't screw it up. That kind of thing. It's like when I was giving years ago, I was giving a TED talk and like I was so nervous, so freaking nervous. I've never been so scared really in my life. And you have to stand on this red dot. You're not allowed to move off the red dot because otherwise the camera's got to pan a lot and it makes people dizzy. And I memorized this thing and I'm doing this thing. And then at some point, like the whole talk was just happening. And at some point a thought came up where I was like, oh my gosh, I think I'm doing it. And then another thought came up was like, don't think, you're going to F it up. That's a yang protector. Right? Fortunately, I just let it go and I just went back to just like doing the thing. Like it didn't take over, you know? But that's the kind of feeling of a yang protector. Now, I just wanted to mention this because these protectors, the yin and the yang protectors, they can get in a polarized relationship with each other. You'll see this very commonly with like eating disorder kind of stuff. I already kind of spoke to it. Whereas the yin protector is like, well, I want to eat whatever I want to eat. And the yang protector is like, you eat what we measure. And they'll get into fights. Now, two yang protector parts can get into fights too. It's not linear. But I just wanted to give that vocabulary so folks that are just starting to look at their parts of themselves in this way, it just gives you a little bit more contour. Does the part want to do something that helps you just numb out? Or do they want to do something that helps kind of control the situation and keep you together? Um, and then you'll start to find that many of your different parts will fall into many of those guardian protector parts will fall into those two categories.
I've never heard that distinction. It's beautiful and very helpful.
Yeah.
Things moving and shifting and shaking over here. Getting that. Thank you.
Yeah.
In some ways, that's a really nice segue into how protector parts can impact creating from the soul. And you spoke to it briefly about this experience of not doing. We named this before we started recording today. I was asking you a little bit about not doing, and
Yeah.
um, yeah, there's a bunch of things I could say, but let's talk about not doing and creating from soul.
Yeah. So I guess curious for us, I could see that we could go a couple different ways here. One way would be to go straight into talking about that. Another way would be to talk about how you can begin inviting your protectors to be okay with something like that. Do you have a sense of where you'd like to, or a third option that I didn't mention?
If anybody's on audio only, I'm shimmering my shoulders over here and just kind of shaking into the question. What's your sense?
Well, my sense would be to talk about how to interact with parts because in order to be able to do that, because um, they're usually the ones that get in the way of doing it in the first place. So having some little tools, not little, but having some functional tools might be an easy way in. Um, so I noticed something interesting. Um, I had a conversation once with Kim Barta, where he was inviting the possibility of, asking the part, what if this part was successful, and I'm not using Kim's words, I can't remember his specific words, but what I got from the conversation with him was when you ask a part, if you were successful in doing what you're trying to do for this person, what would that be? And so sometimes it takes a couple times asking a very similar question. So you have a part of you that, let's say, they're controlling, they're trying to force you to measure your food, for example. So the first thing you do is you say, how do I feel towards this part that's trying to make me control how I eat food? And if you feel angry towards them or frustrated, you ask the frustrated part to step aside. And then you ask the question again. Now, how do I feel towards the part that wants to control how I eat food? Oh, well, I'm not frustrated anymore. Now I feel sad. Oh, will the sad part be willing to unblend? Just come a couple inches to the right so that they're still here. They're going to get all the love they need, but I have some access to some love and curiosity. So then they unblend. Now, how do I feel towards the part that wants to control how I eat? Well, now I'm frustrated, man. There's so many parts. They're covering everything. I'm so annoyed. Hey, would the tired part be willing to step aside? Now, how do I feel? Oh, now I'm curious. Okay. So then from that place of curiosity, I ask the part, if you were successful in controlling how I eat food, what are you hoping I would feel? Well, I want you to feel safe. Well, when you say safe, what do you mean? Well, I just mean you'd feel safe. Well, pretend that you're describing what it was like to sit next to a warm fire and pretend I don't know what the word safe means. Would you just describe the actual qualities? Oh, yeah, it would be soft. It would feel like a hug. Oh, well, would you be willing to show me in my direct experience what that soft hug feels like? So what we're doing now is we're asking the part. I'm not going to like create a state with my meditation experience and focus. We're asking the part from their own volition to turn the volume up on that sense of safety. And all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute. Wait, I just created what I wanted for you. I did that. I didn't have to constrict you. I was using the example of food, but it could be anything. It could be like I need to do really well on exams or whatever. I didn't need to do that. I just could create that sense of safety. And so then, and this is what Kim also invited was, well, now ask the part to turn the volume up so that it's louder than that feeling of constriction, and then sustain it for a little while. The nervous system, there might be newer research on this, but years ago, I was taught to at least have a positive state be sustained for at least 30 seconds. Negative states, you don't need very much time for your nervous system to start creating a pathway to remember. You should only really need to burn yourself once on the stove, once in your life to know that you're never going to do that again, unless it's by mistake, right? You grab the handle once and it's hot, that's it. Positive states are a little harder. Not harder, they just take a little more work. So then you need to spend time with that positive state, and so that it can start to build through your whole body. And so then what happens is you you go through your life, and whenever you feel this part come forward wanting to control something, you just gently remind it, hey, do you want to practice that thing? Because the thing that the part wants you to feel is a projection of its own true nature. So it brings us back to the avocado. Whatever the part says, well, I want you to feel love and connection and warmth. That's their dimension of soul juice. That's the seed of that particular part's avocado. Then they start to discover that. Then they realize they're not a part. They're an emanation of one soul. And so that's a simple practice. Um, it's interesting, I won't go into this, but if you ask the reverse question, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't do your job? That's going to get you, this is an IFS question. So the first questioning was sort of what I learned from Kim. This questioning line of questioning, it takes the part the other direction, helps you discover what they're hiding. Oh, well, I'm worried that if I didn't control you, I'm worried that we would die. I'm worried that we would realize, or I'm worried that we would realize that we're nothing but a complete failure and no one will ever love us again. That starts to point to the wound. So you can track with those two different ways of questioning, you can track the wound or the true nature of the protector. In this context that we're talking about, we're more talking about showing up in the world from soul. So I'm emphasizing the positive qualities.
Yeah, and they're not related, of course. I mean, nothing's not
Right.
related. Um, and part of the process of creating from soul is becoming aware of these wounds and being in relationship with them.
Yeah.
And so the more that these processes occur, the more and more the experience of not doing might come online. I could certainly speak in my own experience. But yeah, it's like the more the protector parts connect to not being separate from and being one with, and the more that the wounds have a chance to metabolize or dissolve, resolve, complete.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Because now the protectors become qualities of virtue. And those are also usually the qualities that that particular wound needs to be enveloped by. Not always, not necessarily. It's not all linear, but I mean, parts usually need love and safety and they're not too complex. I mean, some of them can be, but
Mhm.
and so then yeah, what can start to happen is what can begin as like a state experience of like, oh, I feel luminosity, or I feel at ease, or I feel like I don't need to do, becomes something that the nervous system has now set down pathways for, so that we now start, you can start to have the experience of more and more walking through the world from a place that's completely at ease and or completely in a place of love or compassion. And as that starts to deepen, whenever a part does take over, the contrast is much more noticeable because it's like, a shrieking siren in a like a well of love and luminosity. It's like, oh, that's happening. I better not say words for a few minutes.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly the kind of words that come out of my mouth these days is and I've even in most of my closest relationship we have safe words now in our dynamics, which is like not in this moment.
Yeah. Not time for that conversation, man.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
gonna go sideways. For me, it's like there shouldn't be any of those kinds of conversations after like 9:15 at night.
Okay.
It
Well,
just
see,
takes that.
some of us, Alexander, play hardcore mode, and we actually get together at 9:15 at night because
Oh,
that's when all the stuff that we can't hold back anymore comes out. So
that's right.
we'll stay up till 4 o'clock in the morning, being tired as all get out because you can't hold back any parts.
Oh man. Yeah. No, I try to go to bed as soon as I can. I wake up early too, so I gotta balance it on the other end.
I'm being sincere. We'll actually get together in the middle of the night and stay up all night for the purpose of not being able to hold things back anymore. So that's for those of us who are playing crazy games with this stuff.
That's right. Sounds fun. Well, sort of. Sounds fun when I look at your face saying it.
Oh gosh. Yeah, there's like a preciousness for me of the dynamics where we're actually able to play together like that, because it's not something I would recommend, I guess is what I'm saying. And
Yeah.
I do want to speak to the functionality of the safe words, because in my experience, mm, the time when things get really, really bad is when two protector parts are online. I'm talking about in two different human beings. This is when things can get really bad really fast. And so, if one person is coming from wholeness and another person is coming from a protector part, things can typically still go okay.
Yeah.
Maybe if somebody else is coming from wholeness and I realize I'm in a protector part, I might go, hold on one moment, I need to go um, reset. Like I'll say things like this in my life. I need to take a moment and be with myself. Re, um, I'll just say something's happening for me in this moment. I need to take a moment and be with myself and reset. If two protector parts are active, then that's where I found the safe words to be so supportive, because it can be like, if I say this thing of, hey, I've noticed something's happening for me, I need to take a moment and reset, and somebody else goes, well, you're abandoning me right now, and
Right.
et cetera, then it's like having a pre-agreed upon word or
Yeah.
phrase that says, hey, in this moment, we need to be extra careful, because we could create a lot of harm to our
That's right.
relationship if this gets acted out. Being able to have two resource people have agreed ahead of time that this phrase gets said, it basically means everything stops right now. Let's know that we're deep down in here, we're both good. Deep down in here, we're both loving, and we can come back to this and everything's going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of wisdom there. I like to call what you're describing shadow boxing, where it's like two different people bring an entire village of parts that are always feeling abandoned, parts that are critical, all that stuff. And, um, while you can do what you described, where you intentionally stay up until 4 in the morning and do that, um, I think that it can be really important to, unless you're doing something like that on purpose, to really get to know yourself and what tends to trigger you. Like I mentioned, for me, like 10 o'clock at night, if I've been up since 4 in the morning, like it's harder for me to do anything that I want to do. And it's a way that we can care for each other, to understand that conversations happen in containers, and they happen in environments, and the kind of environment we're in, which includes the time of day, the place, are there like flickering fluorescent lights that are just saying like, curl up and whatever. Taking into account all those things can be really important, so that a lot of relationships will spend hours with parts processing with other parts. And when wholeness isn't there, it's not necessarily healing. And so I'll have clients who they get into this pattern where their relationships are almost solely comprised of processing their relationship. And it's always parts processing parts. And that's why they're still processing like 5 years later, instead of just enjoying each other and like letting certain things go, and not thinking I need to work out my abandonment issues with my partner's part. It just gets very messy and complicated. And so I love what you're describing around safe words and um, just ways of taking care of understanding dynamics, and what does it mean to have a conversation with a partner from wholeness about something difficult? What is it like to have a conversation when your partner is wholeness and in wholeness and you're in a part, or vice versa, or when you're both in parts? And what do you do about that? And do you have a time limit? Like we can only have a half an hour conversation if we can see that we're both coming from parts. None of these like 7 hour marathons where we're like weeping all night and then in the morning feel terrible and more unresolved. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in there around tending.
And again, I mean, we spoke about intercollectives in culture earlier, and when you have a few of these go well in your external collective, again, the culture starts to come online. Like there's something on, there's all the humans, the parts in the one mind, start to go, hey, there's this thing here that's on our side working with us.
Yeah.
I want to check in with you on your energy levels and how you're feeling and see, do you want to pause? Do you want to keep going? How's your
Yeah, I mean, it feels like we covered a lot. Um, it might be a good pausing point. I think we shared a lot in a short period of time. So, I mean, I'm happy to go on if there's more you want to explore, but
Well, I'm glad I said the thing I just said because I want to loop that back into what I shared earlier about the late night sessions. Um, I've never talked about this publicly in any way, so I'm noticing I said one little blurb about it anyway, and I want to tell people that I know there are space practices like dojo, for example, where we're intentionally trying to trigger each other. That's like a it literally is boxing in the space. It's boxing in the subtle tier. And you might imagine, have never found this particularly fun or engaging or helpful. I've been in contexts and dynamics where these things occur, and I don't know, maybe it could be spicy for a moment. I still have never really found myself drawn to it, if I'm being 100% honest. But um, I want to name when I talk about the practice I was discussing earlier in the middle of the night, there is a field that I was speaking of where there's this shared trust of um, there's something on our side, there's something holding us here. Healing's available to all of us in every moment. And the practice we get into is that the dominant aspects of ourselves, the ego state that we might think we are, that would hold anything in the back bedroom of the psyche, gets a little bit too tired to do that anymore. And all those parts get welcomed out into this field of love and compassion and curiosity and understanding. So it's not like, hey, let's all get together and beat each other up. It's like, hey, let's get together and get tired so that anything that's in here that hasn't seen the light gets to have a chance to. And it's actually a
yeah.
pretty healing process. So I just want to like clarify that for anyone listening. Um, it takes some real we space architecture and also people who've really not conceptually, maybe not just listened to a podcast and heard that there's this thing called wholeness or something, but people who've actually deeply experienced it and can embody and emanate and come from wholeness that creates a ground that we might be able to experiment in this way.
Beautiful. That's a good clarification.
Well, I'm feeling pretty whole and pretty complete. Is there any more you'd like to share before we transition?
No, I think this is good. I feel complete.
Are there any offerings that you have right now, courses that you've got available, any ways that people who are listening can further engage with you you'd like anybody to know about?
Sure. One is, one of my websites is EOS Learning Collective. That's EOS learningcollective.com. Um, there's some free things there. There's like an old podcast thing you can go in, and there's a bunch of different there's a bunch of different recordings in there. There's a free course, 7 Days of Transformation. Um, and and then My other website is EOS Wellness Center. And so if people are interested in one-on-one work, I have a mostly full schedule, but um, I do have spots here and there. And so if people are feeling like they're needing some sort of specific care, um, specific to their situation and learning how to go into some of this, that's also a possibility.
Great. I'll link both of those in the show notes so people can easily find them.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks, Alexander. It's been a joy and a treat as always. I appreciate you a lot.
Yeah. Thank you, Forrest. Love being here with you. And also just thanks to all the listeners for checking it out.
Yeah, we love you all.